Welcome back, and we are focusing on developing our sound. One of the biggest things that we do in our process of sound development is choose a mouthpiece. So in this video, I'm going to go over some tips and some tricks, some things that you should be doing when you decide to step up to a new mouthpiece. All right, let's get to it. Ideally, this is what you want to do in the process of getting a new mouthpiece for the purpose of developing your sound, increasing the quality of your sound. So generally, we start with the mouthpiece that comes with the saxophone. The first thing that we do as an upgrade is we actually upgrade our reeds. We go from maybe a 1.5 or a 2, and then we graduate up to a 2.5, and then probably up to a 3, still using the same mouthpiece. From there, what people want to do is get another mouthpiece, but we should instead actually move to a different kind of reed, because just increasing the reed strength isn't really going to give you what it is that you want with the equipment that you have. So you need to get some knowledge about what getting different reeds are going to wind up doing for your sound, and what different brands of reeds are actually meant to do to increase the quality of your sound. So for example, when we were all in school and we were kids and we were beginners, we started out with the orange box Rico reeds. We graduated up to getting a stiffer strength, and then we wanted to move to a different mouthpiece. However, my recommendation, Sirvalorsax's recommendation, is instead of going to a new mouthpiece, first move to the Rico blue box. I still keep calling them Rico Royals, but I think they are officially called Royals by D'Addario. So going from orange box to the Royals by D'Addario, the blue box, this is a much more logical graduation of equipment in order for you to help develop your sound. From there, then we want to stretch out to some other reed brands and make sure that all that time we are learning what we need to do differently with our embouchure in order to get the desired sound that we want. Now, obviously, you need to be listening to a lot of saxophonists, not just your favorite. You need to listen to saxophonists who play very well, whose sound you don't like. Why? Obviously, so you know what not to sound like. But if it's coming from someone who's a great player, then it gives you a certain appreciation for why someone has chosen that sound. And maybe they chose that sound simply by virtue of what equipment they had and they just liked it. Now we want to step up to a new mouthpiece. And generally for alto, we step up to either a C star if you're going in that classical direction, or a Meyer for alto sax if you're going in the jazz, pop, rock, funk direction. So in that case, we now have the knowledge of how reeds can radically change our sound and the feel when we are playing saxophone. What is not so obvious is what we've learned from switching out not just reed strengths, but reed brands. Reed strengths across the brands can differ wildly from one another. So if you're struggling, it's like, oh man, I was playing a 2.5 on this one, and now I got to play a 2 on this one. Like, am I going backwards? It doesn't work like that at all. I had this, one of these inexpensive Chinese mouthpieces, this iBay mouthpiece. I got it, and I used my regular reeds with this lower tip opening. And then I even switched to a stiffer reed of my regular reeds, and I still just did not get the results that I wanted to. So I switched to stiffer cut reeds of the same strength that I normally play, and that opened up the world. Listen to this clip. Yeah, it's the facing is just super low. sure that you have a wide variety of reeds when you are trying mouthpieces. This is critical. Don't just play a mouthpiece with the same stuff that you were doing on your other one and then judge the mouthpiece. You can't do that. It doesn't work like that. These mouthpieces, they all differ wildly in how they are intended to be used. Every person has a different concept of what good sounds like in their head, and what kind of response and what kind of feel they want from the mouthpiece. So you cannot separate the mouthpiece from the reeds. They are paired together. There is no mouthpiece that plays well by itself without a reed, and no reed's going to play without a mouthpiece. So we should always be thinking of, how am I going to pair this mouthpiece? What reeds am I going to use that can work best with this? It's kind of like a chef who's going to pair an excellent wine with a meal or something like this. Okay, let's move on. What are the most important features and attributes of a mouthpiece that matter the most to us as saxophonists? Now, normally you would think, oh, the baffle, right? No. The most important part of the mouthpiece is the facing curve. The tip opening is part of the facing curve. The tip opening determines the length of the separation of the reed from the tip of the mouthpiece, which is determined by the curvature of the mouthpiece. The facing curve is everything. I have an anomalous mouthpiece here that I'm going to show you, and it actually has something of a high, a raised baffle, but it is a very dark sounding mouthpiece. I'll play this clip for you right now. Now, I had some issues with the quality of this mouthpiece, so I just flattened the table on it, and now it's really good, and this is the way that I want it. So I'm not going to adjust it anymore, even though it still has some issues. It is an anomalous mouthpiece because, number one, I had no idea what this mouthpiece was used for. It just said jazz. I'm like, okay, well, what kind of jazz is it? Is it like a traditional kind of jazz? Is it like smooth jazz? That's too general of a description for what this mouthpiece could be used for. So going into it, I had no idea what I was supposed to use this thing for. So I wound up pairing the reeds with it incorrectly. Even after I fixed it, I didn't have the right reed for it. So I wound up using one of my 2.5 stiffer cut classical saxophone reeds with it to get a really nice dark sound. When we as saxophonists talk about tone and purely just tone, what we're talking about is this core aspect in our sound that doesn't have any effects on it at all. But unfortunately, there are other aspects of our sound that are inseparable from tone. I'm going to go over that shortly, but first I'm going to focus on subtone. So what is a subtone? When we talk about a subtone, we're generally referring to a higher percentage of air that's flowing through the mouthpiece when we play. That higher percentage of air creates an audible type of hiss, white noise, or f. This is what we associate with a foo-foo sound. So when we have a high amount of that white noise in our sound, we say that someone has a nice subtone or subtone in their sound. Now, because when you play, there is air flowing through the saxophone, which creates an audible sound. And if you use a subtone, that's going to create an audible sound. Then subtone is inseparable from your tone. All of the core elements that I talk about in the book are inseparable from tone. When we practice exercises that focus on these attributes of our tone, we should be very well aware that these are the fundamental components of our sound. We have tone, articulation, subtone, dynamics, and vibrato. Not necessarily in that order, but those attributes are inseparable from our tone or our sound. Vibrato is pitch modulation. You're actually raising and lowering the pitch slightly, but I don't want to use the word modulation because it sounds like key change, but technically vibrato is pitch modulation. So vibrato, or the lack thereof vibrato, is inseparable from tone. And the other one is dynamics. You have to play at some volume level, whether it's pianissimo, piano, forte, double forte. If you don't play with any dynamic, then you aren't making a sound. So dynamics is inseparable from tone. This is why I have put these together in this book to really focus on your development of sound. Let's focus on subtone and how this relates to mouthpieces. So I have here, this app is called Tonal Energy, and I just want to show you what happens here when we play a subtone. Subtone is often called foo-foo because it emulates this onomatopoeic f sound. So over here, this is the high end frequency sound. Listen to what happens when I make the typical f sound. You can see all this high end white noise increase in volume. So the volume of what is essentially white noise increases when we use a subtone. Saxophonists like Ben Webster, Johnny Hodges in the lower register, Coleman Hawkins, Stan Getz, they play with a magnificent amount of what is essentially hiss in their sound. So usually when it comes to a mouthpiece attribute that is most related to a subtone, it's the thinness of the tip rail. All of my mouthpieces that produce a really good subtone have a thin tip rail. Now, I say in the book, any saxophonist with enough skill and knowledge can make any mouthpiece sound like anything. It's like I said before, if Sirvalorsax took David Sanborn's saxophone straight out of his mouth and played it, he's going to sound like Sirvalorsax. But in understanding the attributes of a mouthpiece, thin tip rail, subtone. Okay, wide side rails are more associated with having more resistance as opposed to thin rails. As far as the baffle goes, definitely the baffle can give you a brighter sound if there's a very high baffle like what we see in a lot of pop and rock type saxophone mouthpieces, where your low baffle, your auto lengths, this kind of stuff is going to give you a much darker kind of sound. Having a high baffle on your mouthpiece can also make the tip opening feel like it's lower than what it generally is. So people have traditionally associated a high baffle with easier altissimo, but in reality, the truth is a high baffle mouthpiece makes the tip opening feel lower, so people wind up getting a bigger tip opening with a high baffle mouthpiece, and a bigger tip opening will facilitate altissimo. Chamber size. Now, it's not enough to just look at the chamber. We also need to look at the side walls of a mouthpiece, because when we talk about chamber, we're really focusing on the inside cavity of the mouthpiece. How open is it versus how narrow it is. One of my favorite mouthpieces to recommend to people is actually the Rico Metalite mouthpiece. So this thing looks like something out of a video game, Roblox, wherever this game is. It looks like you can just build some kind of Tetris mouthpiece, but it is very much associated with being a metal mouthpiece substitute from the time when metal mouthpieces were more associated with playing bright and hard rubber mouthpieces were associated with playing dark. Mouthpiece manufacturing today is phenomenal, to where it doesn't really matter what a mouthpiece is made of. The manufacturer can design the mouthpiece to play ultimately the way they want to. This does not mean that the material doesn't matter. If the mouthpiece was made of carpet, it's going to play different. If you're going to make a bright mouthpiece, you can pair certain things together in order to get a more distinctive, unique brand defining sound. Like you might find a mouthpiece that has very thick sidewalls and a thick tip rail with a small chamber in order to get a more focused, but yet the resistance is coming from a different place with the thickness of the rails, or vice versa. These things can be very, very mixed up. Personally, I like my mouthpieces that do not have a lot of bells and whistles. My main mouthpiece now that I use is this cheap Chinese mouthpiece that I went out and had plated. The internal geometry is very simplistic, brutally simplistic. Let's take a look at the features of these mouthpieces over here. I have this modern vintage Auto Link. We can see that it has relatively thin rails and a thin tip rail, giving me a nice subtone. Very easy to play, and it's got this open cavity here as a chamber. Very nice. It's a little brighter than the regular Auto Link with those features there. See it from the back, just that open straight tube, open chamber mouthpiece here. With the Van Doren, I got this Van Doren T6. This is a small chamber. It's very similar to the Auto Link, except that this one has some thicker side walls here, relatively medium-sized tip rail, and you can see the inside cavity is much more closed off. And this is a small chamber mouthpiece. We move to the Yanagisawa here. We have, I don't know what this material is, but we have relatively medium-sized side rails. Tip rail looks kind of medium to thin, give me a nice subtone. We're looking at it from the back here. You can see we got this squared off chamber, and this is a pretty medium mouthpiece, but I like that I can push it and play it bright, and you can see the inside cavity there is closed off. It's not open like these open chamber mouthpieces. Here I have something that's pretty exotic. I have the KW3 365 TAM from Gary Segal. You can see that it has these very wide sidewalls and a pretty thick tip rail, very aggressive baffle. This mouthpiece with, KW being Kirk Whalum is meant to emulate that kind of sound. Take a look at it from this angle here. Also, on the non-metal sides, I got the Rico Metalite. This is a classic here as a metal substitute. Another extremely unique inside cavity here. You can see we got these flat sidewalls, a very aggressive baffle here into a step baffle. Also, a unique forehead that's right up on the front. Thick sidewalls, thick tip rail there. Take a look at it from this angle here. You can see what that looks like. So here I call this thing the mouth cannon. This is the Jumbo Java. It's got the little elephant on the side. You can see that it has this extraordinarily aggressive baffle here into a step. We got thick sidewalls here, giving me a little resistance there, and a relatively thick tip rail, very long table there, and then just an absolute round small chamber there. Let's take a look at the classical saxophone mouthpiece, the Selmer Soloist. You can see we have very thick side rails, a very thick tip rail, giving us that resistance that is typical with classical music, classical saxophone. And you can see that the inside is small. It's not this open chamber type of mouthpiece. If we take a look from the back here, we have our typical classical saxophone French horseshoe chamber. Sorry that's blurry, but I'm just kind of going through this. And here we have this anomaly of a mouthpiece. Just by looking at it, it looks like it has something of a weird step baffle that's right there with a high raised baffle. You would expect it to play bright. You can see that the rails, the side rails, are kind of thick. This side is thicker than that side. Like I said earlier, I had some issues with this mouthpiece, but I basically just sanded the table and got it to play very, very well. I'm very happy with how it performs now. And I have this thin tip rail, and you can see like on this side right here, it's a bit uneven, but this is the pre-Jody Espina acquisition mouthpiece, so I don't know how many more of these they actually have around, but I want to play some clips for you of me playing these mouthpieces so that way you get an idea of what they sound like. All right, let's do it. All right, ladies and gentlemen, so I do have my sound development book for saxophone. I have my Altissimo books for alto and tenor, and I have my Diminished books also for any musical instrument that are available on PayHip as a digital purchase only. If you like this kind of content and you want to support the channel, you can buy me a piece of cake. It's like a Kickstarter, Patreon type thing that you can do to support the channel here. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to keep it coming at you with all this informative stuff. So thanks for tuning in. That's all I got for you. See ya!